License and registration, and step out of the vehicle. Blue and red lights pulse against the darkness of Dale Mabry Highway, painting the interior of the silver Nissan Altima in alternating strokes of color. The clock on the dashboard reads 9:47 p.m. October air drifts through the window cracked exactly 3 inches, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the closer sound of boots on asphalt. The woman behind the wheel does not move. Her hands remain precisely where she placed them the moment she pulled onto the shoulder. 10 and 2. Fingers visible. Interior dome light already switched on. These are not the instincts of someone unfamiliar with how traffic stops unfold in America after dark. The officer's flashlight beam finds her face, holds there with the kind of deliberate intensity designed to disorient. She does not squint, does not turn away, simply waits, cataloging details that will matter later. The request for registration before establishing identity. The command to exit before explaining the reason for the stop. The absence of any stated justification for why these lights appeared in her mirror 6 minutes ago and followed her for 2 miles before finally activating. Her name is Michelle Sanders. She is 41 years old. She is driving a rental car because her personal vehicle is in the shop with a transmission issue. She has just spent 12 hours at a municipal governance seminar at the Tampa Convention Center, and the conference badge clipped to her blazer reads only M. Sanders, City of Tampa, because anonymity serves her purposes better than recognition, and in approximately 4 hours, the officer currently blinding her with his flashlight will learn exactly why that anonymity mattered. The Hillsborough County Dispatch log will later document this moment with the clinical precision of bureaucratic record-keeping. Call ID 77432, timestamp 2143. Unit 4 David 19 initiating traffic stop on Dale Mabry Highway southbound at Gandy Boulevard. Vehicle described as silver Nissan Altima, Florida plate Echo Bravo Romeo 427. Reason for stop listed as possible stolen vehicle matching. Be on lookout description. What the dispatch log will not record is the fact that the bolo in question was canceled 6 hours earlier. The vehicle matching that description was recovered in Clearwater at 3:15 p.m. by officers from a completely different jurisdiction. The cancellation was broadcast on the county-wide frequency at 15:15 hours, available to any officer whose mobile data terminal was operational. Michelle knows this. She monitored the broadcast herself earlier that afternoon, from an office whose location and purpose she has no intention of revealing tonight. The officer raps his knuckles against the window frame, impatience bleeding through the gesture. She can see his nameplate now that her eyes have adjusted to the assault of the flashlight. Mercer, badge number 4419, 14 years on the force, 3 prior excessive force complaints, all ruled unfounded by internal review processes that never quite managed to examine the evidence too closely. She knows this too. She knows more about Officer Jason Mercer than he would ever be comfortable with a stranger knowing. But for now, she is simply a woman in a rental car on a Tuesday night, and the performance requires that she play the role. The second patrol car arrives before she can respond to his command, pulling up behind the first unit with the kind of coordinated timing that suggests this was never going to be a routine stop. 2 officers now. The new arrival positions himself at the passenger side, hand resting near his belt in textbook tactical formation. His nameplate reads Patterson, badge 4523. 8 years on the force, known among the attorneys who handle police misconduct cases as someone with a talent for creative report writing. Michelle notes the positioning, notes the postures, notes the way both officers have placed themselves to limit her escape routes while simultaneously blocking most camera angles from passing vehicles. They have done this before. The choreography is too smooth for improvisation. The engine of her rental car idles softly, the only sound besides the distant traffic and the occasional crackle of the police radio. She takes one breath, then another, centers herself the way she learned to do in situations far more dangerous than a pretextual traffic stop in suburban Tampa. And then, voice steady as a surgical instrument, she asks the question that every citizen has the right to ask, and so few ever do. Officer, May I ask the reason for this stop? 12 hours earlier, the Tampa Convention Center hummed with the particular energy of municipal professionals gathered to discuss things most citizens never think about: budget allocation frameworks, interdepartmental communication protocols, performance metrics for public service delivery. The kind of work that keeps cities functioning invisibly, noticed only when something goes wrong. Michelle arrived at 7:45 a.m., early enough to claim a seat near the back of the main ballroom where she could observe without being observed. Her registration listed her simply as a representative from the city of Tampa, no department specified, no title attached. The conference organizers had not questioned this vagueness. Government employees attended these seminars constantly, and most preferred to blend into the institutional anonymity that public service provides. She wore what she always wore to events where she might need to disappear into a crowd: charcoal slacks, cream blouse, navy blazer. Professional but unremarkable. The kind of outfit that signaled competence without demanding attention. Her natural hair was pulled back in a low twist, reading glasses perched on her nose, sensible flats instead of heels, because comfortable shoes mattered more than fashion when you might need to move quickly. The morning session covered ethics in municipal governance, a topic that held particular relevance to her actual work, though no one in the room could have guessed why. She took notes with the meticulous precision that had defined her career since she first joined the Tampa Police Department 23 years ago, back when she was a patrol officer herself, and the idea of investigating her fellow officers would have seemed like betrayal rather than duty. Her note-taking system would have seemed excessive to a casual observer. Timestamps in the left margin, accurate to the minute. Speaker names and credentials documented at the beginning of each section. Direct quotes placed in quotation marks with attribution. Paraphrased content clearly distinguished from verbatim transcription. Everything organized in a pattern that would allow her to reconstruct the entire session months later if necessary. This was not paranoia. This was professional habit. In her line of work, the difference between a conviction and a dismissal often came down to whether someone had documented the details that everyone else assumed would be remembered accurately. The morning break arrived at 10:15, and Michelle joined the migration toward the coffee station set up in the hallway outside the ballroom. The line moved slowly, giving her time to observe the other attendees: city managers from Clearwater and St. Petersburg, budget analysts from Hillsborough County, a few state officials from Tallahassee, whose presence suggested the seminar carried more significance than its generic title implied. She was examining the pastry selection when a woman in expensive athleisure approached, with the kind of smile that preceded unwelcome assumptions. "Excuse me, do you know if there are more coffee carafes coming? This one's almost empty." The question was directed at Michelle specifically, despite the fact that 3 actual catering staff members stood less than 10 feet away wearing clearly marked uniforms. The woman did not seem to notice them. Or perhaps she noticed and simply decided that Michelle, in her professional attire and conference badge, more closely resembled the help she was accustomed to addressing. Michelle could have corrected her, could have pointed to her badge, explained that she was an attendee, allowed the woman's face to cycle through the familiar sequence of embarrassment and defensive justification. Instead, she simply gestured toward the catering station with a small movement of her hand. "I believe they have more over there." The woman walked away without thanks, already forgetting the interaction that Michelle would remember for much longer. Not with anger, exactly, more with the weary recognition that some things did not change no matter how many degrees you earned or how high you climbed. Some people would always see the skin before they saw the person, and no amount of professional achievement could purchase exemption from that fundamental reality. She collected her coffee and returned to the ballroom, adding a small notation in her conference notes. 10:22 a.m. Assumption of service role by unknown attendee. Brief interaction. No correction offered. The words meant nothing to anyone who might read them later. But Michelle had learned long ago to document the small indignities alongside the large ones. Sometimes patterns only became visible when you mapped enough individual points. If you're already invested in where this is going, hit that subscribe button because this story is just getting started. The lunch break brought another encounter, this one more substantive. Michelle had taken a seat at one of the round tables scattered through the corridor outside the ballroom, reviewing the afternoon agenda while eating a surprisingly acceptable chicken salad sandwich. A man in his 50s settled into the chair across from her, the kind of corporate casual uniform that suggested middle management in some county department. "Mind if I join you? Everywhere else is packed." She gestured toward the empty seat in acceptance, returning her attention to the agenda. But the man seemed inclined toward conversation. "I couldn't help noticing your notes earlier. You're quite thorough. What department are you with?" "City of Tampa. General Administration." The answer was technically true while revealing nothing useful. "Ah, I'm with Pinellas County Budget Office. We're always looking for best practices from other municipalities." He extended a hand across the table. "Frank Morrison." She shook it briefly. "Michelle Sanders." "What specifically brings you to the governance seminar? The ethics module or the performance metrics section this afternoon?" "A little of both. Oversight structures interest me." The word oversight seemed to catch his attention, though she could not tell whether from genuine interest or simple conversation momentum. "Oversight. Are you involved in auditing?" "Something like that." The vagueness was intentional, and Frank Morrison either sensed her reluctance to elaborate or simply lost interest in pursuing the thread. He turned the conversation toward the budget challenges facing Pinellas County, a topic sufficiently bland to carry them through the remainder of lunch without requiring Michelle to reveal anything about herself. She noted his name and department in her documentation anyway, not because she suspected him of anything, but because the habit of recording every interaction had become second nature over 2 decades of investigative work. You never knew which detail would matter until it mattered, and by then, it was too late to remember accurately. The afternoon sessions focused on performance metrics for public service delivery, a topic that drew her genuine professional interest. Good metrics could reveal patterns that intuition alone would miss. Bad metrics could obscure problems that everyone preferred not to see. The distinction between the two often came down to who designed the measurement systems and what they hoped to find or avoid finding. She thought about District 7 as the presenter discussed common pitfalls in metric design. The district whose traffic stop data showed unusual patterns, whose use of force reports contained statistical anomalies that did not quite rise to the level of obvious misconduct, but also did not quite align with legitimate police activity, whose complaints against officers seemed to vanish into administrative processes that never reached conclusions. 18 months ago, those patterns had landed on her desk in the form of a federal inquiry. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division had noticed what local oversight had failed or refused to see. They proposed a joint investigation, a pattern or practice review that would either clear the district of wrongdoing or provide the documentation necessary for reform. Michelle had agreed to lead the internal side of that investigation. It was not a popular decision within the department. It was not meant to be. Internal affairs existed to investigate wrongdoing regardless of how that investigation affected morale or institutional loyalty. The officers who understood this accepted it as the price of accountability. The officers who did not understand it were usually the ones who ended up in her case files. The conference concluded at 5:30 p.m. with a networking reception that Michelle skipped entirely. She had no interest in small talk with strangers, and her actual networking needs were served through channels that did not involve name badges and appetizer trays. Instead, she returned to her rental car in the convention center parking garage, documented the existing scratches on the vehicle with photographs from her phone, and began the drive toward her home in Brandon. The rental was a concession to circumstances she had not anticipated when she scheduled the conference attendance. Her personal vehicle, a 7-year-old Honda Accord with 140,000 miles, and the particular loyalty that came from regular maintenance, had developed a transmission shudder 3 days earlier. The dealership promised it would be ready by Friday. Enterprise had provided the silver Nissan Altima as a replacement, and Michelle had selected it from the available options specifically because it was the most generic vehicle on the lot. She preferred vehicles that did not attract attention. In her professional life, anonymity was a tool as valuable as any badge or warrant. The drive from downtown Tampa to Brandon normally took 25 minutes at this time of evening, traffic having thinned from the rush hour congestion that made the commute miserable for anyone who kept standard business hours. Michelle settled into the rental's unfamiliar seat, adjusted the mirrors to her preferred angles, and merged onto Interstate 275 with the practiced ease of someone who had driven these roads for more than 2 decades. Her phone sat in the cup holder, connected to the vehicle's Bluetooth system for hands-free calls. At 6:15, it rang with a familiar number. "Hey, Mama." The voice belonged to Keisha Sanders, 20 years old, junior at Florida State University, majoring in criminal justice with a minor in sociology. The irony of her daughter choosing to study the system that Michelle had spent her career trying to reform was not lost on either of them, though they had learned to navigate conversations about policing with the careful diplomacy of people who loved each other too much to let professional disagreements become personal wounds. "Hey, baby, how was your day?" "Long. 3 classes plus a study group for my constitutional law midterm. Professor Davis assigned 200 pages of case law for Thursday." "You handling it?" "Mostly. The Fourth Amendment stuff is actually interesting. Search and seizure doctrine, exclusionary rule, all that. Makes me think about what you deal with at work." Michelle smiled at the connection her daughter had made without prompting. "Your grandmother would say you've got law enforcement in your blood." "Grandma would say a lot of things. Most of them would involve me finding a nice young man and settling down instead of reading Supreme Court opinions at midnight." "She means well." "She means she wants grandbabies before she's too old to spoil them." The conversation continued through the remainder of Michelle's drive, covering the mundane details that formed the connective tissue of family relationships. Keisha's roommate drama, the upcoming homecoming weekend at FSU, whether Michelle would be able to visit before Thanksgiving, or whether work would keep her trapped in Tampa through the fall. That question carried more weight than either of them acknowledged directly. Michelle's work had always demanded sacrifices from her family, time and attention diverted toward investigations that could not be discussed at dinner tables or explained during parent-teacher conferences. Keisha had grown up understanding that her mother's absences served a purpose larger than any individual case, but understanding something intellectually did not always translate into accepting it emotionally. "I'll try to get up there next month," Michelle said as she exited the interstate onto the surface streets that would carry her the final miles home. "No promises, but I'll try." "That's what you always say, Mama." "I know, and I'm always sorry when I can't keep it." They said their goodbyes as Michelle turned onto the commercial strip that marked the boundary between Tampa proper and the suburban sprawl of Brandon. Fast food restaurants and strip malls lined both sides of the road, their signs blazing against the gathering darkness. Normal American landscape, normal Tuesday evening. She did not notice the patrol car until she had passed the second traffic light. It appeared in her rearview mirror without any of the obvious signals that usually preceded police attention. No siren, no lights, just a white cruiser maintaining a consistent distance of 3 car lengths, regardless of how her speed fluctuated within the legal limit. When she changed lanes to pass a slower vehicle, the cruiser changed lanes. When she returned to the right lane, so did the cruiser. Most drivers would not have noticed. Most drivers did not pay attention to the vehicles behind them unless those vehicles did something aggressive or dangerous. But Michelle had spent too many years on both sides of surveillance to mistake coincidence for deliberate behavior. She was being followed. The only question was why. Her first instinct was to call the office. Marcus Thompson, her senior investigator, would be monitoring District 7 activity as part of their ongoing pattern review. He could run the cruiser's unit number, verify whether this was a coincidence or something more concerning. But she did not make that call. Instead, she continued driving at exactly the posted speed limit, hands at 10 and 2, behavior giving no possible justification for a stop. If this was what she suspected it might be, the documentation would be more valuable than any intervention from her office. The blue lights activated as she passed Gandy Boulevard. She pulled onto the shoulder with the same deliberate movements she taught to every officer who attended her department's training sessions on traffic stop procedures. Signal first. Slow gradually. Find a well-lit area if possible. Turn off the engine. Turn on the interior light. Roll down the window partway. Keep hands visible at all times. These were the instructions police gave to citizens. Most citizens never needed to follow them. Michelle had followed them perhaps 50 times in her career, always with the knowledge that her badge would smooth whatever friction the stop might generate. Tonight, she did not have her badge. It was locked in her desk drawer at headquarters, along with her credentials and her service weapon, and every other marker of the authority she carried in her professional life. Tonight, she was simply Michelle Sanders, civilian, driving a rental car that some unknown officer had decided warranted investigation. The first officer approached her window within 60 seconds of her coming to a complete stop. Flashlight aimed directly at her face, silhouette massive against the backdrop of headlights and emergency lights. His voice carried the particular tone that certain officers adopted when they believed they were dealing with someone who had no power to challenge them. License and registration, and step out of the vehicle. She kept her hands on the steering wheel, visible in the glow of the interior light. "Officer, may I ask the reason for this stop?" The question was not a challenge. It was an exercise of constitutional rights that every citizen possessed, regardless of how officers might feel about being asked to explain themselves. Terry v. Ohio, decided by the Supreme Court in 1968, established that officers could not detain citizens without reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Florida Statute 901.151 codified similar principles into state law. The question was legally appropriate and practically necessary for anyone who might later need to contest the legality of a detention. Officer Mercer did not seem interested in legal niceties. "Vehicle matches a stolen car report. Now step out." His tone left no room for discussion, but Michelle did not move immediately. Instead, she processed the information he had provided and compared it against what she already knew. The vehicle matches a stolen car report, a silver Nissan Altima with Florida plates in the Echo Bravo Romeo series, the Bolo that was canceled 6 hours ago when the actual stolen vehicle was recovered in Clearwater. Either Officer Mercer was working from outdated information, which would suggest incompetence, or he knew the Bolo was no longer valid and was using it as pretext, which would suggest something far more troubling. "I have the rental agreement in the glove compartment," she said, keeping her voice neutral and informational. "This vehicle is a rental from Enterprise on Dale Mabry. May I reach for it?" The request was standard protocol. You asked permission before moving your hands toward any location an officer might perceive as threatening. You announced your intentions clearly. You gave them no excuse to claim you made any sudden or suspicious movements. Mercer's response was not standard protocol. "I said step out. Now." The passenger side officer, Patterson, had positioned himself with his hand resting near the taser on his belt. Not on the weapon itself, which would have been an obvious escalation, but near enough to make the implied threat clear. His flashlight beam swept the interior of the vehicle, lingering on the laptop bag in the back seat, the conference materials on the passenger seat, the cup holder where her phone sat dark and silent. Michelle made a decision that would later be analyzed in disciplinary hearings, federal depositions, and media coverage that would spread far beyond Tampa. She chose not to argue. She chose to comply. The door opened smoothly, and she stepped out onto the gravel shoulder with movements so deliberate they might have been rehearsed. Hands visible at all times, no sudden gestures, nothing in her behavior that could be characterized as threatening or resistant. Mercer gestured toward the hood of the vehicle. "Hands on the car, feet apart." She complied, assuming the position that would allow him to conduct a pat-down search if he chose. The metal was warm beneath her palms, engine heat lingering from the 40-minute drive. Gravel crunched behind her as Mercer approached, his footsteps heavy with the confidence of someone who believed this encounter would proceed according to his script. "You have any weapons on you? Anything sharp? Anything I need to know about?" "No weapons. No contraband. My driver's license is in my wallet in my back pocket, and the rental agreement is in the glove compartment." Patterson moved to the passenger side of the vehicle without asking permission, opened the door, and began rifling through the glove compartment. The action was technically a search without consent, though the legal boundaries around vehicle searches were murky enough that officers routinely pushed them without consequence. He emerged holding the enterprise rental agreement, a standard form that listed Michelle's name, driver's license number, and the vehicle identification number of the Altima she was leasing through the end of the week. He examined it with the skepticism of someone looking for reasons to disbelieve what he was seeing. "Enterprise Rent-A-Car," he read aloud. "Agreement number 7729483. Renter, Michelle D. Sanders. Vehicle 2023 Nissan Altima. VIN, ending 427. Rental period, October 14th through October 21st. The document was unambiguous. The vehicle was not stolen. It was a legitimate rental, properly documented, legally in Michelle's possession. Any reasonable officer would have recognized this as the end of the encounter, the moment when you apologize for the inconvenience and send the citizen on their way. Mercer did not apologize. Instead, he studied the document that Patterson handed him with the expression of someone searching for flaws that were not there. "This could be forged. We're going to need to verify this." Michelle turned her head slightly, enough to see his face in her peripheral vision without releasing her hands from the hood of the car. "Enterprise has a 24-hour customer service line. The number is on the agreement. They can verify the rental in about 2 minutes." "That's not how this works." The words hung in the autumn air, revealing more than Mercer probably intended. "That's not how this works." A statement of power rather than procedure. An assertion that he would decide the parameters of this encounter regardless of what law or policy or basic common sense might suggest. Michelle had heard this tone before, had documented it in dozens of complaints filed by citizens who encountered officers like Mercer, had watched it play out in body cam footage that showed how quickly traffic stops could transform from routine inquiries into dangerous confrontations. She recognized the script. The question was how far he intended to follow it. The bolo for the silver Altima with Echo Bravo Romeo series plates was canceled at 15:15 hours today. Her voice remained steady as she spoke, offering information that should have resolved the situation immediately. "The vehicle was recovered in Clearwater this afternoon. You can verify with dispatch." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it stretched with the particular tension of a moment when someone realized they had underestimated the person they were dealing with. Mercer's flashlight beam wavered slightly. Patterson's hand, which had been resting near his taser, moved a few inches toward his radio before stopping. "How do you know that?" The question contained layers of suspicion that Michelle chose to leave unaddressed. She could have explained that bolo cancellations were broadcast on frequencies that anyone with a scanner could monitor. She could have mentioned that the information was technically public record, available to any citizen who knew how to request it. She could have revealed who she actually was, and watched both officers scramble to undo the damage they had already done to their careers. Instead, she offered the minimum explanation necessary to answer the question. "It's public information. The cancellation was broadcast on the county-wide frequency." This was true, though it did not explain how a civilian would have access to police radio frequencies or the knowledge to interpret what she heard. Mercer seemed to sense the gap between her explanation and her evident familiarity with law enforcement procedures, but he was not prepared to confront it directly. His radio crackled with routine traffic from dispatch, and he keyed the microphone without taking his eyes off Michelle. "Unit 4 David 19 to dispatch. Request verification on bolo status for silver Nissan Altima, plate Echo Bravo Romeo 427. The response came within 30 seconds, the dispatcher's voice professionally neutral as she delivered information that should have ended the encounter. "Unit 4 David 19, that bolo was canceled at 15:15 hours. Vehicle recovered by Clearwater PD, case closed. No current alerts on that plate." Michelle said nothing. She did not need to. The dispatch confirmation had just verified everything she had told them, revealing that the stated justification for this stop was invalid. A reasonable officer would now apologize, return her documents, and allow her to continue home. Mercer was not feeling reasonable. She could have switched plates, or cloned the VIN, We're going to need to run this through more thoroughly. The excuses were transparent, flimsy constructions designed to justify continued detention despite the collapse of probable cause. Michelle recognized the pattern from countless complaints she had reviewed in her professional capacity. The officer who could not admit he was wrong, who would rather manufacture new justifications than acknowledge that his initial suspicions were unfounded. This is about to get intense. If you want to see what happens when the truth comes out, hit that like button now. Patterson had returned to searching the vehicle without consent, his flashlight probing the back seat where Michelle's laptop bag and conference materials sat in plain view. He emerged holding the laptop case, unzipping it to reveal a standard Dell work computer, charger cables, and a folder of printed documents. "What's on the laptop?" The question was directed at Michelle, but she did not answer. She had no legal obligation to explain the contents of her personal property during a traffic stop, and anything she said could be twisted into justification for further intrusion. "I asked you a question." Patterson's voice carried an edge now, frustration building as the encounter failed to produce whatever he had been hoping to find. "Is the laptop relevant to the reason for this stop?" Her response was calm, factual, completely devoid of the hostility that Patterson's tone suggested he expected. This was the technique she had trained herself to use over years of conducting interviews with officers accused of misconduct. Neutral language, clear questions, nothing that could be characterized as aggressive or uncooperative. Mercer stepped closer, positioning himself between Michelle and the road where passing traffic occasionally slowed to observe the flashing lights. "You've got a lot of questions for someone in your position." "I'm attempting to understand the legal basis for my continued detention. The BOLO that allegedly justified this stop has been confirmed as invalid. Is there another reason you're preventing me from leaving?" The question was direct, precise, and legally significant. Under Florida law, officers could not extend a traffic stop beyond the time necessary to complete its original purpose without developing new reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Every minute that passed without such justification was another potential violation added to the documentation Michelle was already compiling mentally. Mercer seemed to recognize the trap she was laying, though his response suggested he believed himself immune to consequences. "You want to know why we're still here? Fine, I'll tell you why. Because you're sitting in a parking garage spot at the convention center for 3 hours, according to the lot attendant. Because you're driving a vehicle that just happens to match a stolen car description. Because you know more about police radio frequencies than any ordinary citizen should. And because your attitude since we started talking has been hostile and uncooperative." The accusations were revealing in what they omitted. The parking garage observation suggested Michelle had been under surveillance before the stop even began. The BOLO reference was now irrelevant given the dispatch confirmation. The radio frequency comment implied that knowing one's rights was itself suspicious, and the characterization of her behavior as hostile and uncooperative was contradicted by every moment of the encounter so far. She filed each point away for later documentation, adding them to the mental catalog that had been growing since the blue lights first appeared in her mirror. "Is this a Terry stop or a full custodial detention?" The question cut through Mercer's building anger with surgical precision. Terry v. Ohio had established the legal framework that governed investigatory stops, distinguishing between brief detentions based on reasonable suspicion and full custodial arrests requiring probable cause. The distinction mattered enormously for Fourth Amendment purposes, and most citizens had no idea it existed. Mercer's expression shifted, uncertainty flickering beneath the aggressive posture he had maintained since approaching her window. "What did you say?" "I asked whether this is a Terry stop or a full custodial detention. The distinction affects my obligations under Florida Statute 901.151. The statute citation landed with visible impact. Patterson exchanged a glance with his partner, the kind of wordless communication that suggested they had wandered into territory neither had anticipated. This was not the docile compliance they had expected. This was something else entirely. A vehicle slowed on the highway behind them, and Michelle caught the glint of a phone screen through its window. Someone was recording. Good. The more documentation existed, the more difficult it would be for anyone to later dispute what had actually happened here. Mercer keyed his radio again. Unit 4, David 19, requesting supervisor to my location. The request represented an admission, however implicit, that the situation had exceeded his ability to control. Patrol officers did not call supervisors to routine traffic stops that were proceeding according to plan. They called supervisors when something had gone wrong or when they needed backup in making decisions that might later be questioned. Michelle remained where she was, hands still resting on the warm hood of the rental car, posture communicating compliance, even as her mind continued cataloging every detail that would later become evidence in proceedings these officers could not yet imagine. The supervisor arrived 8 minutes later, a sergeant whose cruiser pulled up with the measured pace of someone responding to a situation rather than an emergency. Michelle watched in her peripheral vision as the new officer conferred briefly with Mercer and Patterson, their voices too low to carry over the ambient traffic noise. Sergeant Linda Hoffman was 52 years old with 19 years on the force, and a reputation among the officers who served under her for loyalty that sometimes shaded into protection of conduct that deserved scrutiny rather than cover. Michelle knew her name from the District 7 files, though they had never met in person. Hoffman supervised the patrol unit that had generated more citizen complaints per capita than any other unit in the Tampa Police Department. The sergeant approached with the energy of someone who wanted this situation resolved quickly and cleanly. Her flashlight stayed pointed at the ground rather than at Michelle's face, a small courtesy that distinguished her approach from Mercer's aggressive tactics. "Ma'am, I understand there's been some confusion here. If you could just cooperate with my officers, we can get this sorted out and have you on your way." Michelle turned to face her, moving slowly and keeping her hands visible throughout the motion. "Sergeant, I've been fully cooperative since this stop began. I've provided my license and rental agreement. Your officer has confirmed with dispatch that the bolo he cited as justification for this stop was canceled hours ago. I'm unclear on what additional cooperation is required." Hoffman's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. This was not the response she had expected. Civilians, particularly black civilians, stopped at night on semi-deserted highways, were supposed to be grateful for the intervention of supervisors. They were supposed to see the sergeant's arrival as an opportunity to escape whatever trouble they had found themselves in, not as another layer of authority to question. "Your attitude isn't helping the situation." The words were a variation of what Mercer had already said, the same accusation repackaged in supervisory language. Michelle noted the consistency. When officers could not articulate specific misconduct, they fell back on characterizing the citizen's demeanor as the problem. Attitude, tone, hostility, words that meant nothing legally but carried enormous weight in the internal narratives officers constructed to justify their actions. "I'm not aware that attitude constitutes probable cause for extended detention." The response was mild, factual, and completely accurate under both constitutional law and Florida statute. Hoffman seemed to recognize this, though her recognition did not translate into acknowledgement. "We're just trying to verify that this vehicle isn't stolen. If you've got nothing to hide, this will go quickly." The nothing to hide formulation was a classic manipulation, one that Michelle had watched officers deploy countless times in interrogation rooms and traffic stops. It implied that asserting one's rights was evidence of guilt, that only criminals would object to violations of their constitutional protections. Every civil liberties organization in America had published material explaining why this reasoning was dangerous and wrong, and yet officers continued using it because, more often than not, it worked. "My cooperation with this stop does not extend to waiving my constitutional rights. I've provided identification and documentation of lawful possession of this vehicle. If there's a specific legal basis for continued detention, I'd like to understand what it is." Hoffman's jaw tightened. She was accustomed to deference, accustomed to citizens who backed down when confronted with the combined authority of multiple officers and flashing lights. Michelle was not backing down, and the sergeant seemed uncertain how to proceed. "Fine, we'll need to search the vehicle." The announcement came without preamble, a unilateral decision that ignored everything Michelle had said about legal procedures and constitutional protections. Do you have a warrant? We have probable cause. The BOLO. The BOLO was canceled, and even if it weren't, a matching vehicle description doesn't authorize a search of the interior. Arizona versus Gant, 2009. The Supreme Court held that vehicle searches incident to arrest must be limited to circumstances where the arrestee might access the vehicle or where evidence of the crime of arrest might be found. There's been no arrest, and the alleged crime was vehicle theft, not possession of contraband. The case citation stopped Hoffman mid-motion, her hand hovering near the radio she had been about to key. Legal arguments from citizens were unusual enough to be disorienting, and Michelle had just demonstrated familiarity with Supreme Court precedent that most attorneys would need to look up. Are you a lawyer? I'm a citizen who knows her rights. The answer revealed nothing while simultaneously explaining everything. Hoffman studied her with new uncertainty, clearly reassessing the assumptions that had guided her approach to this encounter. If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind if we take a look, just to clear this up. The nothing to hide trap again. Michelle felt a flash of something that might have been anger but tamped it down before it could affect her voice or expression. Anger would be characterized as aggression. Aggression would become justification. Every emotion she displayed would be weaponized against her in any subsequent documentation. I do not consent to any searches of my person, vehicle, or belongings. I invoke my right to remain silent. I want an attorney present before any questioning. The formal invocation was deliberate, creating a legal firewall that would complicate any attempt to use the remainder of this encounter against her. Once a suspect invoked their rights, officers were required to cease questioning and provide access to counsel. The requirement was often honored in the breach rather than the observance. But the invocation itself created a record that would matter in any subsequent proceedings. Hoffman exchanged a look with Mercer that communicated something Michelle could not quite read. Then she nodded toward the vehicle. Officer Mercer detected an odor of marijuana emanating from the interior. That gives us probable cause to search. The lie was so brazen that Michelle almost laughed. Almost. She managed to convert the impulse into a flat stare that communicated her understanding of exactly what had just happened. I don't smoke. I don't use any controlled substances. This vehicle is a rental that was cleaned before I received it 3 days ago. There is no marijuana odor because there is no marijuana. That's not how Officer Mercer's report is going to read. Hoffman's response was chilling in its casual acknowledgement of what was happening. She was not even pretending that the marijuana claim was legitimate. She was simply informing Michelle that reality was whatever they decided to write in their reports, and Michelle's protestations would carry no weight against the documented assertions of 3 police officers. The search took approximately 15 minutes. Patterson and Mercer went through every compartment of the Nissan Altima with the thoroughness of officers expecting to find something incriminating. They examined the glove compartment, the center console, the space beneath the seats. They opened Michelle's laptop bag and paged through her conference materials. They checked the trunk, which contained nothing except the spare tire and emergency kit that came standard with the vehicle. They found no marijuana, no drugs of any kind, no weapons, no contraband, nothing illegal, nothing suspicious, nothing that supported any of the justifications they had offered for this stop and search. Michelle stood on the shoulder throughout, hands clasped in front of her, watching the systematic violation of her Fourth Amendment rights with the composed expression of someone documenting evidence rather than experiencing trauma. Every movement the officers made was cataloged in her memory. Every word they spoke was filed away for later reconstruction. The methodology was instinctive after so many years, but the subject matter was novel. She had investigated many stops like this. She had never been the target of one. The search concluded with Patterson emerging from the back seat, empty-handed and visibly frustrated. He exchanged another glance with Mercer, a silent communication that seemed to carry weight beyond its apparent content. Mercer approached Michelle with a different energy now, the initial aggression replaced by something more calculated. You're going to cooperate with us now. Tell us who you really are and what you're actually doing driving around with police radio frequencies and case law citations. I'm Michelle Sanders. I'm a resident of Brandon, Florida. I attended a conference in Tampa today and I'm trying to get home. That's who I really am and what I'm actually doing. That's not good enough. It's the truth. The truth doesn't require your approval to be valid. Mercer's hand closed around her upper arm with enough force to leave marks that would be visible the next morning. We're placing you under arrest. The words carried the finality of a decision already made, independent of any legal justification that might support it. Michelle did not resist the grip, did not pull away, did not give him any basis to claim she had been physically non-compliant. On what charge? Resisting an officer without violence. Florida Statute 843.02. The charge was fiction. Michelle had not resisted anything. She had answered questions, provided documents, stood where instructed, kept her hands visible at all times. The only thing she had done was assert her constitutional rights and question the legal basis for her detention. Under Florida law, neither of those actions constituted resistance. I have complied with every lawful instruction. What specific act constitutes resistance? Mercer did not answer. Instead, he spun her around with a rough motion that sent pain shooting through her shoulder and forced her hands behind her back. The handcuffs clicked into place with the particular sound that Michelle had heard thousands of times, always from the other side of the equation. She kept her voice steady, despite the position, despite the pain, despite the knowledge that everything about this arrest was illegal. I am not resisting. I am complying under protest. This arrest is unlawful, and I am noting it for the record. Patterson approached to conduct a pat-down search, the final indignity in a cascade of violations that had begun with blue lights in a rearview mirror and was now concluding with handcuffs too tight around her wrists. His hands moved over her clothing with the clinical efficiency of someone who had done this many times, but they lingered in places that served no investigative purpose. That contact is inappropriate, and I'm noting it for the record. He stepped back without acknowledgement, but Michelle saw Hoffman glance toward the highway where more phones had appeared in passing windows. The sergeant seemed to be calculating something, weighing the growing audience against whatever plan had brought them to this point. The ride to District 7 station took 12 minutes in the back of Mercer's patrol car. The rear seat was hard plastic designed for maximum discomfort, the handcuffs positioned to prevent any possibility of adjusting her arms into a less painful configuration. Michelle sat in silence, watching the familiar streets pass outside windows she could not open, adding this experience to the catalog of injustices she had spent her career trying to document and address. She was counting. It was the only thing that kept her centered, the only way to convert the humiliation and discomfort into data that would eventually serve a purpose. Unlawful stop based on invalid BOLO. 1. Unlawful extended detention without developing new reasonable suspicion. 2. Unlawful search justified by fabricated marijuana odor claim. 3. Fabricated probable cause statement. 4. Unlawful arrest on charges unsupported by any evidence. 5. Excessive force during the application of handcuffs. 6. Inappropriate contact during pat-down search. 7. 7 violations so far. The night was not over. The booking process at District 7 followed the same procedures Michelle had observed countless times from the other side of the counter. Fingerprints pressed against the scanner, ink residue leaving dark smudges on her fingers. Photograph taken against a height chart, her face carefully neutral despite the circumstances. Personal belongings inventoried and sealed in a plastic bag marked with a case number that would follow this arrest through whatever proceedings might come. Her belongings included her phone, now powered down and beyond her reach, her wallet with the driver's license that had already been documented, the car keys for a rental vehicle that was probably being towed at this very moment, the conference badge that read M. Sanders, City of Tampa. The booking officer, a young woman whose nameplate read Collins, processed her with the efficient detachment of someone who had learned not to see the people behind the paperwork. But when she entered Michelle's information into the system, something made her pause. Her fingers stopped moving over the keyboard. Her expression shifted from routine to uncertain. "One moment, ma'am." She stepped away from the counter, moving toward a phone mounted on the wall of the booking area. Michelle could not hear the conversation that followed, but she watched Collins's body language shift from curious to concerned to something approaching alarm. The young officer glanced back at Michelle twice during the call, her expression suggesting she had just learned something that complicated her understanding of this entire situation. When she returned to the counter, her demeanor had changed entirely. "Ma'am, I need to have you wait here while I consult with my supervisor." The wait stretched into 20 minutes, then 40, then an hour. Michelle sat on a metal bench in the booking area, hands cuffed in front of her now rather than behind, watching the institutional clockwork of a police station continue its midnight operations around her. Officers came and went. Dispatch calls crackled from radios. The coffee machine in the corner dispensed cups of liquid that might generously be called coffee. At 12:47 a.m., they moved her to an interview room. The space was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, with a metal table bolted to the floor and chairs on either side designed for function rather than comfort. Recording equipment sat on the table, obvious and unsubtle, a reminder that everything said in this room would be preserved. Mercer entered first, Patterson close behind. They had taken time to compose themselves since the roadside stop, their uniforms straightened, their expressions arranged into the professional neutrality that would look better on camera than the aggression they had displayed earlier. "Ready to talk now?" Mercer's question assumed a cooperation that Michelle had no intention of providing. She had invoked her right to counsel. She had invoked her right to remain silent. Any questioning that continued beyond those invocations was a violation of her Fifth Amendment protections, and anything she said would be potentially excludable from any subsequent proceedings. "I've invoked my right to counsel. I won't answer questions without an attorney present." The response should have ended the interview before it began. It did not. "Look, this can go easy or hard. You tell us where you got that car, we might be able to work something out." "The car is a rental. I've provided documentation. I've suggested you call Enterprise. I have nothing else to add." Patterson leaned forward, adopting the posture of someone trying to establish rapport. "We're trying to help you here. The more you cooperate, the easier this goes. Cooperation with unlawful interrogation is not in my interest, and I believe you know that." The response seemed to surprise both officers. Civilians in custody rarely pushed back against questioning with such clarity, particularly after several hours of detention and discomfort. Most people in Michelle's position would be exhausted, frightened, desperate to say whatever might get them released. She was none of those things. Mercer stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a sound that echoed in the small room. "Fine. You want to do this the hard way? We've got all night. Let's see how you feel in a few more hours." He left, Patterson following, and the door closed with a solid thunk that communicated exactly how much separation now existed between Michelle and the outside world. The next few hours will change everything. Subscribe now so you don't miss what happens when they find out who they really arrested. She sat alone in the interview room for another 2 hours, the minutes crawling past with agonizing slowness. Her shoulders ached from the handcuffs. Her back protested the hard chair. Her bladder reminded her that she had not been offered a restroom break since her arrest more than 4 hours ago. These discomforts were deliberate. She recognized the technique from training materials she had helped develop for the department's interrogation protocols: extended isolation, physical discomfort, the slow erosion of will that made suspects more likely to say whatever they thought might end their ordeal. At 1:15 a.m., she was finally allowed her phone call. One call, monitored, time-limited, the right that even the most basic procedural protections guaranteed to anyone in custody. She dialed a number she knew from memory, one that would not appear in any public directory or departmental record. "This is Sanders. I'm at District 7. The situation has escalated." The voice that responded was male, calm, professional. "Understood. Thompson is en route. ETA 20 minutes. Tell him to come through the front. I want this documented." "Copy that." She hung up without further explanation. The desk sergeant who had monitored the call noted the brief conversation but showed no sign of understanding its significance. Just another arrestee calling their lawyer. Just another piece of routine business in a station that processed dozens of such calls every night. Marcus Thompson arrived at 1:38 a.m., entering District 7 through the main entrance with the unhurried pace of someone who knew exactly what he was walking into. He was 38 years old, 12 years with the department, the senior investigator in internal affairs, and one of the few people who knew the full scope of Michelle's current assignment. He was not actually her attorney, but the badge concealed beneath his jacket was not something he intended to reveal until the moment was strategically optimal. "I'm here to see Michelle Sanders, currently in custody." The desk sergeant checked his computer, scrolled through screens, frowned at something he saw there. "One moment, sir." Thompson waited while the sergeant made a phone call, spoke in low tones, glanced back at him with an expression that had shifted from routine to wary. Whatever flag existed in Michelle's file had apparently triggered some kind of alert that was now propagating through the station's chain of command. 5 minutes later, he was led to the interview room where Michelle sat alone, still handcuffed, still wearing the blazer and slacks that were now wrinkled from hours of detention. Her expression when she saw him was carefully neutral, revealing nothing of whatever relief she might have felt at the arrival of someone who could begin the process of unraveling this disaster. "This interview is over." Thompson's voice carried the authority of someone whose statements were not suggestions. Mercer, who had apparently been monitoring from somewhere, appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely concealed hostility. "Who the hell are you?" "Her attorney, and this interrogation is being conducted in violation of her invoked rights. We're done here." The attorney claim was technically false, but it served its purpose. Mercer stepped back, uncertainty replacing aggression, as he tried to assess this new variable in an equation that had been going sideways since Michelle first asked for the reason she was being stopped. Thompson requested copies of all documentation: the arrest report, the probable cause affidavit, the body cam footage. He cited Florida Statute 119.07, the public records law that guaranteed citizens access to government documents upon request. His recitation was smooth, professional, exactly the kind of legal knowledge that an attorney would possess. The documents were produced with reluctant compliance. Thompson photographed each page with his phone, creating backup copies that would exist outside the department's control. The arrest report read like fiction, describing an encounter that bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. The probable cause statement claimed Michelle had exhibited hostile and uncooperative behavior, refused to follow verbal commands, and questioned officer authority repeatedly. Every word was a lie. Every claim was contradicted by the body cam footage that both officers had apparently forgotten was recording throughout the encounter. Thompson read the key passage aloud, his voice flat and uninflected. Arrestee exhibited hostile and uncooperative behavior during lawful traffic stop. Arrestee refused to follow verbal commands and questioned officer's authority repeatedly. Based on these observations and the suspect vehicle matching active BOLO description, probable cause existed for arrest under Florida Statute 843.02, resisting officer without violence. He looked up from the document, meeting Michelle's eyes with an expression that communicated far more than words could in this monitored space. The fiction they had constructed was about to collapse under the weight of video evidence they had not yet realized existed. The shift change at 2 a.m. brought new personnel into District 7, including a sergeant named David Reyes, who had no connection to the night's events and no apparent interest in protecting officers who might have overstepped their authority. He reviewed the booking file with the thoroughness of someone who understood that paperwork was where careers went to die, and something he found there made him reach for the phone. The watch commander received his call at 2:08 a.m. Lieutenant Patricia Moore was not typically summoned to the station for misdemeanor arrests, but the information Reyes provided suggested this was not a typical arrest. She arrived at 2:23 a.m. with an expression that promised consequences for whoever had created this situation. Moore was 54 years old, 26 years on the force, one of the few women to reach command rank in the Tampa Police Department. Her reputation was built on competence and an absolute intolerance for officers who embarrassed the department through avoidable misconduct. She did not suffer fools, and the officers who had arrested Michelle Sanders had just demonstrated themselves to be exactly that. She reviewed the booking file first, then the arrest report, then the body cam footage that had been uploaded to the cloud backup system per department policy. The footage showed everything: the invalid bolo, the rental agreement, Michelle's calm compliance throughout the encounter, the fabricated marijuana claim, the search that found nothing, the arrest for resistance that never occurred. And then, buried in the timestamp around the 38-minute mark, something that made Moore's blood run cold. 2 officers, standing just out of Michelle's earshot, having a conversation they believed was private. Patterson's voice, uncertain. Mercer's response, confident. Words that would become Exhibit A in a federal civil rights prosecution. "What are we charging her with?" "The rental checks out. Enterprise confirmed it." 843.02. Resisting. "She copped an attitude, that's enough." "That's thin. What if she's got a lawyer?" "Then we add obstruction. We'll figure it out. Just back my report, I'll back yours." "Just back my report, I'll back yours." The words hung in the air of the watch commander's office, damning in their casual acknowledgement of exactly what these officers had done. They had conspired to file false reports. They had coordinated their testimony before writing their documentation. They had committed federal crimes under 18 U.S.C., Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. And they had done it all while wearing body cameras that recorded every word. Moore summoned Mercer and Patterson to her office with the kind of command that left no room for delay or excuse. They appeared within minutes, postures still projecting the confidence of officers who believed they had handled a difficult situation appropriately. That confidence evaporated the moment Moore turned her computer screen to face them. "Explain to me why you arrested a woman for resisting when your own body cam shows she complied with every instruction." Mercer's face went pale. Patterson's hand moved involuntarily toward his belt, as if reaching for something that might save him. Neither seemed capable of producing words. "She had an attitude, Lieutenant. She was questioning everything, citing laws Citing laws isn't a crime, Officer Mercer. Being black while knowing your rights isn't a crime." Moore's voice was cold, controlled, the voice of someone who had already decided how this would end. She pulled up another file on her screen, and what appeared there transformed the disaster into a catastrophe. "Do either of you know who Michelle Sanders is?" Patterson found his voice first, though it emerged weak and uncertain. "Some woman with a rental car and a bad attitude." Moore turned the screen fully toward them both. On it, an internal personnel file. A photograph that matched the woman currently sitting in the interview room down the hall. A title that neither officer had imagined possible. Director, Internal Affairs Division, Tampa Police Department. Below that, a case file reference that explained why the Director of Internal Affairs had been driving through District 7 territory on a random Tuesday night. Case file IAD 2C23, Love 147. Subject, District 7 Patrol Unit. Status, active federal oversight, pattern or practice investigation. Monitoring period, 18 months. Mercer's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Patterson looked like he might be physically ill. Both men had just realized, far too late, that the woman they had illegally detained, illegally searched, and illegally arrested was the person specifically tasked with investigating officers exactly like them. Moore let the silence stretch for a full 10 seconds before speaking again. "You just arrested the head of Internal Affairs during an active federal investigation into your unit." The words landed like physical blows, each one adding weight to the disaster that was now unavoidable. Mercer tried to form a response, some explanation that might mitigate what they had done. We didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't check, because you assumed, because you saw a black woman in a nice car and decided she must be a criminal." The accusation was precise, clinical, exactly the kind of analysis that would appear in the disciplinary findings that were now inevitable. Moore stood, her posture communicating dismissal even before she spoke the words. "Return to your vehicles. Turn off your body cams and remain there until Internal Affairs arrives to take your statements. Do not speak to each other. Do not contact anyone outside this building. You are both suspended pending investigation, effective immediately." The suspension was preliminary, administrative, the first step in a process that would likely end both their careers. Mercer and Patterson left Moore's office with the shuffling steps of men who had just watched their futures collapse. Down the hall, in the interview room that had become an unlikely staging ground for the final phase of an 18-month investigation, Michelle Sanders sat quietly as Marcus Thompson showed her the body cam footage on his phone. The timestamp on the recording matched her mental catalog of violations, confirming what she had already known. Every illegal action had been documented. Every fabricated claim had been contradicted. Every lie had been recorded in high-definition audio and video. She allowed herself a small, grim smile. The investigation was not over. In many ways, it was just beginning. There would be administrative hearings and federal depositions and media coverage that would transform this single encounter into a symbol of everything wrong with American policing. There would be resistance from the union and the political machinery that protected officers from consequences. There would be attempts to minimize, to deflect, to characterize her as the problem, rather than addressing the systemic failures that had created the situation. But she had the receipts. Every moment documented, every violation preserved, every lie contradicted by evidence that could not be disputed or disappeared. Lieutenant Moore appeared in the doorway of the interview room, her expression communicating the gravity of what she now understood. She addressed Michelle with the formality appropriate to the circumstances. "Director Sanders, I apologize for the conduct of these officers." Michelle rose from the chair where she had spent the past several hours, feeling the stiffness in her joints and the lingering pain in her shoulders from handcuffs applied with excessive force. Her response was not personal. It could not be. This was larger than any individual slight or injury. "The apology is noted, but this isn't about me. It's about the pattern these officers represent." She reached into her blazer pocket, retrieved the credentials she had kept concealed throughout this ordeal. The laminated card bore her photograph, her name, and her title. Internal Affairs Division, Tampa Police Department, Director Michelle D. Sanders. Badge number IAD-001. For the record, I'm activating the final phase of case file IAD 2023-1147. Contact Assistant State Attorney Angela Rivera. This matter is now under joint jurisdiction with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. The words carried the weight of 18 months of investigation, hundreds of documented incidents, patterns of misconduct that stretched back years before anyone had bothered to look closely. District 7 had operated as if accountability was something that happened to other people. Tonight, accountability had finally arrived. Moore nodded, already reaching for her phone to begin the cascade of notifications that would consume the next several hours. As she stepped into the hallway to make her calls, Michelle turned to Thompson with an expression that acknowledged the exhaustion beneath her professional composure. "How long until Rivera can get here?" "She's already on her way. Should arrive within the hour." "Good. And the body cam backup?" "Secured. It confirmed the cloud upload completed before anyone thought to try deleting it. We have everything." Everything. The word felt almost too comprehensive for what they actually possessed. Evidence of a single illegal stop. Documentation of coordinated false reporting. Proof that at least 2 officers, and quite possibly their supervising sergeant, had violated federal civil rights law in ways that could not be explained away or minimized. But Michelle knew that everything was also not enough. Mercer and Patterson were symptoms, not causes. The system that had trained them, promoted them, protected them from consequences for years before this night, that system would survive their individual downfalls. It would adapt, recalibrate, find new ways to protect itself from the accountability it existed to provide. The real work was only beginning. She sat back down in the chair that had held her for hours, suddenly aware of how tired she was. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the stop, the search, the arrest, the hours of isolation, all of it was draining away now that the immediate crisis had passed. What remained was exhaustion and the certain knowledge that this night would follow her for a very long time. Thompson took the chair across from her, his presence a reminder that she was not entirely alone in this. He had been her investigator for 3 years, one of the few people in the department she trusted completely. His loyalty was not to the institution, or to the badge, but to the principles that both were supposed to represent. You should eat something. It's been almost 12 hours since the conference. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're running on fumes and determination. There's a vending machine down the hall. She managed a small smile at his concern. Later, after Rivera gets here. After we've documented the chain of custody for all the evidence. After we've begun the process that's going to consume the next several months of our lives. He nodded, understanding that her priorities were fixed and her energy was limited. There would be time for self-care later. Right now, there was work to do. The clock on the wall read 3:42 a.m. In approximately 4 hours, the morning shift would arrive at District 7 station to find their world transformed. Officers who had worked alongside Mercer and Patterson would learn that their colleagues had been suspended. Supervisors who had looked the other way would realize that the looking away had been documented. And somewhere in the administrative machinery of the Tampa Police Department, the slow process of accountability would begin its grinding work. Michelle watched the second hand sweep around the clock face, counting moments that would eventually become months, then years. The federal investigation would take time. The administrative hearings would take time. The legal proceedings, if charges were filed, would take time. Justice moved slowly. She had learned that truth decades ago, when she first pinned on a badge and believed that wearing the uniform meant fighting for something worthy. The years since had taught her that the uniform meant nothing without the will to hold it accountable. That institutions protected themselves before they protected citizens. That change came not through dramatic revelations, but through the patient accumulation of evidence too overwhelming to ignore. Tonight had provided that evidence. Tomorrow would begin the work of using it. For now, she sat in a police station where she had been arrested, wearing the same clothes she had put on for a governance conference nearly 20 hours ago, waiting for the machinery of justice to catch up with what she already knew. The officers who had detained her believed they were above consequences. They believed the badge protected them from accountability. They believed that black women who knew their rights were problems to be managed rather than citizens to be served. They had been wrong about all of it, and in the days and weeks and months to come, they would learn exactly how wrong they had been. Assistant State Attorney Angela Rivera arrived at District 7 at 4:22 a.m., entering through the main doors with the measured stride of someone who had been awakened from sleep and was not pleased about the circumstances that required her presence. She was 46 years old, 17 years with the state attorney's office, and possessed a reputation for meticulous preparation that made defense attorneys nervous and sloppy police work expensive. She had also been the federal liaison for case file IAD 2023-1147 since its inception, coordinating between the Tampa Police Department's Internal Affairs Division and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division in Washington. The call summoning her to District 7 had not surprised her. She had been expecting something like this for months, ever since the pattern analysis began revealing just how deeply the problems in District 7 ran. What surprised her was the identity of the person who had been arrested. Rivera found Michelle in the interview room, still wearing the conference attire that had accumulated 12 hours of wear and 4 hours of detention. Thompson sat across from her, laptop open, already beginning the documentation process that would consume the coming weeks. The watch commander had provided coffee at some point, 2 paper cups sitting half empty on the metal table. Director Sanders. Rivera's voice carried the formality appropriate to the situation, though her eyes communicated something warmer. I understand we have a situation. Michelle gestured toward the empty chair beside Thompson. Situation is one word for it. I'd call it a gift if I'm being honest. The characterization seemed to surprise Rivera, who settled into the offered seat with an expression of professional curiosity. A gift? 18 months of investigation, hundreds of documented incidents, statistical analysis showing clear patterns of misconduct. And none of it was going to be enough to overcome qualified immunity and union protection. Michelle's voice was tired but certain. Tonight, 2 officers provided us with something we couldn't manufacture. Body cam footage of coordinated false reporting. Conspiracy to deprive rights under color of law. Federal charges that bypass all the institutional barriers we've been fighting. Rivera processed this with the rapid calculation of someone accustomed to evaluating legal strategies under pressure. You're saying your arrest was actually beneficial to the investigation. I'm saying they handed us evidence we could never have obtained through normal channels, every violation documented, every lie contradicted by their own recordings, every element of 18 U.S.C. Section 242 captured on video. The federal statute she cited was the cornerstone of civil rights prosecution against law enforcement officers. Deprivation of rights under color of law. It carried penalties up to 10 years imprisonment, or life imprisonment if the violation resulted in death. Most officers never faced such charges, because the burden of proof was extraordinarily high and juries were reluctant to convict police. But body cam footage of officers explicitly agreeing to file false reports changed that calculation entirely. Rivera pulled out her phone and began typing notes, her fingers moving with the speed of someone whose thoughts often outpaced her ability to record them. Walk me through the timeline, everything from the initial stop to right now. Michelle obliged, reconstructing the night's events with the precision that had defined her career. The blue lights appearing in her mirror at 9:41 p.m. The 2-mile follow before the stop was initiated. The demand for license and registration before any stated justification. The invalid bolo that had been canceled 6 hours earlier. The fabricated marijuana odor claim. The search that found nothing. The arrest for resistance that never occurred. Each element was documented with timestamps, badge numbers, and specific statutory violations. Rivera's expression grew increasingly grim as the narrative progressed, her legal mind cataloging the civil rights implications of each individual act. The search is particularly problematic, she observed when Michelle reached that portion of the account. They cited marijuana odor as probable cause, but the body cam audio clearly shows no such claim until after they'd already decided to search. Post hoc justification. They searched first, then invented the legal basis. Michelle's tone was clinical, analytical, the voice of someone who had investigated hundreds of similar incidents. It's a pattern we've documented across District 7. Officers learn that certain claims, marijuana odor, furtive movements, officer safety concerns, these phrases provide legal cover regardless of whether the underlying facts support them. Because no one challenges them. Because challenging them requires resources most defendants don't have, and because juries tend to believe officers over civilians. Michelle paused, considering how to frame what she was about to say. But juries also believe video, and we have video of everything. The documentation process continued through the pre-dawn hours, Thompson handling the technical aspects while Rivera focused on legal strategy. By 6 a.m., they had compiled a preliminary evidence package that included the complete body cam footage from both officers, the dispatch logs confirming the bolo cancellation, the rental agreement proving lawful possession of the vehicle, and Michelle's detailed account of every violation. The package was transmitted to 3 destinations simultaneously: the Tampa Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, where it would trigger formal administrative proceedings; the Hillsborough County State Attorney's Office, where it would be evaluated for potential state criminal charges; and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, where it would be incorporated into the existing pattern or practice investigation that had been building for 18 months. Multiple tracks, multiple jurisdictions, multiple opportunities for accountability. This was how you defeated institutional resistance to reform, not through any single case, but through coordinated pressure from every available direction. Lieutenant Moore returned to the interview room at 6:30 a.m. with news that Sergeant Linda Hoffman had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The supervisor who had authorized the search and arrest was now facing the same scrutiny as the officers she had supervised. The pattern of accountability was expanding, exactly as Michelle had designed it to. "What about Deputy Chief Walsh?" Michelle's question cut through the procedural updates with surgical precision. Moore's expression shifted, uncertainty replacing the confidence she had displayed since taking control of the situation. "Walsh? Why would the deputy chief be involved?" "Because District 7 doesn't operate in isolation. Because the patterns we've documented required institutional protection to persist for this long. Because someone above Hoffman has been ensuring that complaints disappear and investigations conclude without findings." The accusation hung in the air, heavy with implications that extended far beyond 2 patrol officers and their immediate supervisor. Moore seemed to weigh her response carefully before speaking. "That's above my pay grade, Director. I can tell you what happened in my station tonight. I can't speak to department-wide politics." "Understood." Michelle's tone suggested she had expected no different answer. "But you should know that the federal investigation isn't limited to patrol officers. It extends to anyone who enabled or concealed misconduct, regardless of rank." Moore absorbed this information with the expression of someone realizing that the disaster she had been managing was actually much larger than she had understood. She excused herself to continue coordinating the station's response, leaving Michelle alone with Thompson and Rivera. The morning shift change brought new personnel into District 7, officers and administrative staff who arrived to find their workplace transformed by the night's events. Word spread quickly through the informal networks that existed in every police department, whispers and speculation building into a narrative that would be refined and contested in the coming days. By 8 a.m., the first media inquiries began arriving. A local television station had received an anonymous tip about a significant incident at District 7. A newspaper reporter called the Public Information Office seeking comment on rumors of officer suspensions. The story was escaping containment, spreading into the public sphere where it would take on a life of its own. Michelle watched these developments unfold from a borrowed office on the second floor, monitoring email updates on her phone while Thompson coordinated with the internal affairs staff who had begun arriving to process the evidence. She had not slept in more than 24 hours, but the adrenaline of the night was being replaced by something more sustainable. Purpose. The clear understanding that everything she had worked toward for 18 months was finally coming to fruition. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter. "Saw something on Twitter about TPD. You okay?" She typed back a response that was true without being complete. "I'm fine. Long night at work. We'll call you later." The call would require careful navigation. Keisha knew her mother worked for the police department, knew she was involved in oversight and accountability, but did not know the full scope of the investigation that had consumed Michelle's professional life for the past year and a half. There were things you could not share with family, burdens that had to be carried alone for the protection of everyone involved. At 9:15 a.m., Deputy Chief Robert Walsh arrived at District 7. His presence was unusual enough to draw attention from everyone in the building. Deputy chiefs did not typically visit district stations, particularly not on weekday mornings when administrative meetings and political obligations normally consumed their schedules. Walsh's arrival suggested that the situation had escalated to levels that required executive attention. Michelle observed his entrance from the second-floor window, watching him move through the parking lot with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to commanding spaces. He was 58 years old, 32 years on the force, a political survivor who had navigated multiple administrations and emerged from each transition with his position intact. His reputation was built on loyalty, the kind of institutional devotion that prioritized the department's image over its actual conduct. He was also, according to 18 months of investigation, the person most likely responsible for ensuring that District 7's problems never faced meaningful scrutiny. Thompson appeared in the doorway of the borrowed office, his expression communicating urgency without alarm. "Walsh is asking to speak with you, privately." "I'm sure he is." Michelle did not move from her position by the window. "Tell him I'll meet with him in the presence of ASA Rivera and with the conversation recorded for the official record." The message would not be well received. Walsh had built his career on private conversations, informal understandings, the kind of off-record negotiations that allowed problems to be managed without creating documentation. Michelle was refusing to play that game, insisting on conditions that would transform any meeting into potential evidence. Thompson returned 5 minutes later. He declined, said it was just a professional courtesy call, nothing that required formal documentation. Of course he did. Michelle finally turned from the window, her expression communicating the grim satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had just been confirmed. Note the time and the nature of his request. Add it to the file. The file in question was growing larger by the hour. Every interaction documented, every decision recorded, every attempt to influence the investigation preserved for later review. This was how you built cases against people who had spent their careers learning how to avoid accountability. You documented everything until the weight of evidence became impossible to ignore. If you're invested in seeing this corruption exposed, hit that subscribe button. The next part reveals just how deep this goes. The administrative hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, a timeline that reflected both the urgency of the charges and the procedural requirements that governed disciplinary proceedings. Officers Mercer and Patterson were entitled to representation, to review of evidence, to the opportunity to present their version of events. These rights existed regardless of how overwhelming the evidence against them might be. Michelle spent the intervening weeks in a state of controlled activity, balancing the demands of the investigation with the mundane requirements of her position. Reports to write, meetings to attend, staff to supervise. The machinery of internal affairs continued its operations, even as its director processed the personal and professional implications of her own arrest. The bruises on her arms faded from purple to yellow to nothing visible at all. The shoulder pain that had followed the rough application of handcuffs gradually diminished. The physical evidence of the night's violations disappeared, leaving only documentation and memory to carry the weight of what had happened. Keisha called twice during those weeks, conversations that danced around the edges of what Michelle could not fully explain. Her daughter had seen the news coverage, the carefully worded statements from the department, the speculation from legal analysts about what the incident might mean for police accountability in Tampa. She had questions that Michelle answered as honestly as partial truth allowed. "Were you really arrested?" "Yes." "For what?" "For knowing my rights and exercising them." "That's not illegal." "No, it's not, which is why the officers involved are facing consequences." The explanation was accurate without being complete. Keisha accepted it with the trust of someone who had grown up watching her mother navigate the contradictions of working within a system she was trying to reform. Some things did not require full explanation. Some truths were evident in their outcomes. The hearing convened on a Tuesday morning in early November, 3 weeks and 2 days after the traffic stop that had set everything in motion. The venue was a conference room on the 4th floor of Tampa Police Headquarters, large enough to accommodate the principals and observers, but small enough to maintain the sense of gravity appropriate to proceedings that would determine the future of multiple careers. Michelle sat at a table facing the 3-member hearing panel, Rivera beside her as legal advisor rather than prosecutor. The state attorney's office had declined to file criminal charges pending the outcome of the administrative process, a decision that reflected both prosecutorial caution and the complex politics of charging police officers in local courts. The federal investigation remained ongoing, its potential charges held in reserve while the administrative track played out. Mercer and Patterson sat at a separate table with their union representative and private attorney, a configuration that emphasized the adversarial nature of the proceedings, even as the format maintained a facade of internal review. Their expressions communicated the particular defiance of people who still believed they might escape the consequences of their actions. The hearing officer was Captain Diana Reyes from the Professional Standards Bureau, a 23-year veteran with a reputation for fairness that had earned her both respect and resentment, depending on which side of her decisions you found yourself. She opened the proceedings with the standard recitation of rights and procedures, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. We are here to review allegations of misconduct against Officer Jason Mercer, Badge 4419, and Officer Kyle Patterson, Badge 4523, arising from events on October 15th of this year. The charges include violation of department policy regarding traffic stops, false statements in official reports, unlawful search and seizure, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The charges were administrative rather than criminal, carrying potential penalties ranging from written reprimand to termination. Criminal charges, if they came, would follow a separate track with separate procedures and separate standards of proof. For now, the question was whether Mercer and Patterson would remain employed by the Tampa Police Department. The evidence presentation began with the body cam footage, played in its entirety on a screen mounted at the front of the room. 47 minutes of video that showed everything from the initial activation to the arrival at District 7. Every word, every action, every violation captured in high-definition clarity. Michelle watched the footage with the detachment of someone reviewing evidence rather than reliving trauma. She had seen it dozens of times during the preparation phase, analyzing each moment for its legal and procedural significance. The emotional weight had been processed and filed away, replaced by the clinical assessment that effective investigation required. The room was silent as the video reached the critical passage, the conversation between Mercer and Patterson that had transformed a problematic arrest into a federal civil rights matter. "What are we charging her with?" The rental checks out. Enterprise confirmed it. 843.02, resisting. She copped an attitude, that's enough. That's thin. What if she's got a lawyer? Then we add obstruction. We'll figure it out. Just back my report, I'll back yours. Just back my report, I'll back yours. The words filled the conference room with their casual acknowledgement of conspiracy. The hearing panel members exchanged glances that communicated shared understanding of the significance. The union representative shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even the private attorney seemed momentarily at a loss for how to address what the video had just revealed. Captain Reyes paused the footage. "Officer Mercer, would you like to explain this exchange?" Mercer's attorney intervened before his client could respond. "My client reserves the right to address all evidence during his opportunity to present a defense." "Noted, but I'm asking now whether Officer Mercer has any explanation for what we just heard." The question was direct, pointed, exactly the kind of inquiry that defense attorneys preferred their clients avoid. Mercer looked to his attorney, received a subtle shake of the head, and remained silent. The footage continued, showing the arrival at District 7, the booking process, the hours of detention. It showed Michelle invoking her rights, requesting an attorney, asking for the legal basis of her continued detention. It showed officers ignoring those invocations, continuing their interrogation despite clear constitutional violations. When the video ended, Captain Reyes turned to the internal affairs investigator who had compiled the evidence package. "Investigator Thompson, please summarize the policy violations documented in this footage." Thompson consulted his notes with the methodical precision that characterized his work. Violation 1, initiating a traffic stop based on a bolo that had been canceled 6 hours prior. This constitutes failure to verify current information before detention. Violation 2, extending the stop beyond the time necessary to complete its stated purpose without developing new reasonable suspicion. This violates both department policy and Fourth Amendment requirements established in Rodriguez v. United States. Violation 3, conducting a vehicle search based on fabricated probable cause. The claimed marijuana odor appears nowhere in the footage until after the decision to search had already been made. Violation 4, arresting the subject for resisting without violence despite no evidence of resistance. The footage shows complete compliance throughout the encounter. Violation 5, filing official reports containing material false statements. Both officers' arrest reports describe events that are contradicted by their own body cam recordings. 5 violations, each one independently sufficient for termination under department policy. Combined, they painted a picture of systematic disregard for constitutional rights and professional standards. Thompson continued. Additionally, the recorded conversation between Officers Mercer and Patterson constitutes evidence of conspiracy to file false reports, a violation of Florida Statute 837.06 and potentially of 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. The federal statute citation hung in the air, a reminder that these proceedings were not the end of potential consequences. Criminal charges remained possible, pending the outcome of the DOJ investigation that was running parallel to the administrative process. The defense presentation began after a 30-minute recess, during which Michelle observed Mercer and Patterson conferring urgently with their legal team. The union representative seemed particularly agitated, his gestures suggesting disagreement with whatever strategy was being proposed. When proceedings resumed, the private attorney opened with a framing that Michelle had anticipated. Officer Mercer and Officer Patterson are decorated members of the Tampa Police Department with a combined 30 years of service. On the night in question, they responded to what they believed was a legitimate vehicle theft alert and conducted themselves according to their training and experience. The argument was predictable: good cops acting in good faith, following procedures, making reasonable decisions based on available information. The standard defense that had protected countless officers from accountability for conduct far worse than what was at issue here. But the body cam footage made that defense untenable. "Counsel," Captain Reyes interrupted, "how do you reconcile the good faith characterization with the recorded statement, quote, 'Just back my report, I'll back yours'?" The attorney's pause lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but it communicated everything about the weakness of his position. That statement, taken in context, reflects the kind of informal communication that occurs between partners during stressful situations. It does not necessarily indicate intent to fabricate. "It doesn't?" Reyes's tone was skeptical. "Because to me, it sounds exactly like two officers agreeing to coordinate false testimony." "That's one interpretation." "What's another interpretation?" The attorney did not have a good answer. His silence stretched until it became its own form of testimony, an acknowledgement that some evidence was simply too clear to argue against. The hearing continued for another 4 hours, covering every aspect of the October 15th incident and its aftermath. Mercer and Patterson both testified, their accounts contradicted at every significant point by the video record. Sergeant Hoffman testified via video link, her statements careful and hedging in ways that suggested she understood the danger of saying too much while remaining on administrative leave herself. When the evidentiary portion concluded, Captain Reyes announced that findings would be issued within 10 business days. The timeline was standard for disciplinary proceedings, allowing the panel to review the record and draft conclusions that would withstand potential legal challenge. Michelle left the hearing room with the measured pace of someone who had accomplished what she set out to do. The evidence was on the record. The violations were documented. Whatever the panel decided, the facts could not be disputed or disappeared. Rivera walked beside her through the headquarters corridor, their footsteps echoing against marble floors that had witnessed decades of similar proceedings. "That went about as well as we could have hoped." "It went according to the evidence. The panel will do what the evidence requires." "You sound confident." "I'm confident in the documentation. The rest depends on whether the institution is willing to hold itself accountable." The distinction was important. Good evidence did not guarantee good outcomes. Institutional resistance could undermine even the strongest cases if the will to enforce standards was absent. Michelle had seen it happen before, investigations that produced overwhelming proof of misconduct but resulted in minimal consequences because someone with authority decided that protecting the institution mattered more than protecting the public. She did not think that would happen here. But she had been wrong before. The findings arrived 9 days later, delivered electronically to all parties at 8 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. Michelle read them in her office, coffee cooling beside her keyboard as she absorbed the conclusions that would shape the next phase of the investigation. Officer Jason Mercer, terminated, effective immediately, violations sustained on all 5 counts, recommendation for decertification, forwarded to Florida Department of Law Enforcement, Criminal Justice Standards and Training Commission. Officer Kyle Patterson. Suspended without pay, 180 days. Termination proceedings deferred pending completion of remedial training and probationary monitoring period. Violations sustained on 3 of 5 counts. Sergeant Linda Hoffman. Written reprimand. Failure to adequately supervise subordinate officers. No termination, no suspension, no meaningful consequence for the supervisor who had authorized the search and arrest. Michelle read the Hoffman finding 3 times, each repetition deepening her frustration. The sergeant had been present during the stop. She had authorized the fabricated probable cause claim. She had allowed the unlawful arrest to proceed without intervention. And her consequence was a written reprimand that would sit in her personnel file, invisible to the public, irrelevant to her career. This was what institutional accountability looked like in practice. The lowest-ranking officer received the harshest consequence. His partner received a suspension that would end in 6 months with his career intact. Their supervisor received a slap on the wrist that amounted to no consequence at all. The pattern was familiar. Michelle had documented it in dozens of cases during her years leading internal affairs. Accountability flowed downhill, accumulating at the bottom of hierarchies while dissipating as it approached those with actual power. The system protected itself by sacrificing its most expendable members while shielding those whose positions made them valuable to the institution. Thompson appeared in her doorway, his expression suggesting he had received the same findings and reached the same conclusions. Hoffman got nothing. Hoffman got what the system was willing to give her, which is almost nothing. And Walsh? The question addressed the absence that loomed over the entire proceeding. Deputy Chief Robert Walsh had not been mentioned in the findings, had not been interviewed during the investigation, had not been identified as a subject of any inquiry related to the October 15th incident or the patterns of misconduct it represented. Walsh is protected, Michelle said flatly. Protected by rank, by political connections, by the same institutional dynamics that let Hoffman walk away with a reprimand. So what do we do? The question was the right one to ask. The administrative process had produced outcomes that were better than nothing but far short of what justice required. The state criminal track remained inactive, prosecutors unwilling to charge officers when the administrative findings suggested the department was handling the matter internally. Only the federal investigation offered potential for the kind of accountability that would actually address the systemic problems. We give everything we have to the DOJ. We let the federal process run its course. And we document whatever resistance emerges as that process moves forward. Thompson nodded, understanding that the fight was not over. It was simply moving to a different arena. This is far from over. If you want to see whether justice actually gets served, hit that like button now. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division issued its preliminary findings 6 weeks later, on a Friday afternoon in December, when most of the nation's attention was focused on holiday preparations. The timing was deliberate, allowing the federal investigators to release their conclusions with minimal media attention while still meeting their statutory reporting requirements. The document ran 47 pages, dense with legal analysis and statistical evidence that supported conclusions Michelle had suspected for 18 months. Pattern or practice violations in District 7 of the Tampa Police Department. Systematic deprivation of constitutional rights, particularly affecting Black residents of the district. Inadequate supervision and accountability mechanisms that allowed misconduct to persist unchallenged. The findings cited specific incidents, including the October 15th arrest, as exemplars of broader patterns. They referenced statistical disparities in traffic stops, use of force, and complaint resolutions that could not be explained by legitimate law enforcement factors. They documented the failure of internal oversight mechanisms to identify or address obvious problems, and they announced that the Department of Justice was opening a formal investigation under 42 U.S.C. Section 14141, the federal statute that authorized the government to seek injunctive relief against law enforcement agencies engaged in patterns of constitutional violations. The investigation would likely take years. Federal pattern or practice cases moved slowly, requiring extensive discovery, expert analysis, and negotiation over potential consent decrees that would govern department reform. But the opening of the investigation itself was significant, a formal acknowledgement that the problems in District 7 required federal intervention because local accountability mechanisms had failed. Media coverage intensified following the DOJ announcement, transforming Michelle's arrest from a local controversy into a national story about police accountability. Reporters sought interviews. Civil rights organizations issued statements. Political figures offered opinions that ranged from supportive to defensive, depending on their constituencies and convictions. Michelle declined most interview requests, preferring to let the documentation speak for itself. She was not interested in becoming a symbol or a spokesperson. She was interested in results, in actual changes to how policing was conducted and how misconduct was addressed. Celebrity would not serve those goals. Evidence would. The federal investigation brought new demands on her time and attention. DOJ attorneys required access to internal affairs files that had accumulated over years of inadequate oversight. They requested interviews with current and former officers, some of whom cooperated willingly, while others invoked their Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. They analyzed data that Michelle's office had compiled, but never had the authority to act upon. In early January, 3 months after the traffic stop that had started everything, the investigation produced its first federal charges, not against Mercer or Patterson, whose conduct fell within categories that state prosecution might eventually address. Against Deputy Chief Robert Walsh. The indictment alleged conspiracy to deprive citizens of civil rights under 18 U.S.C. Section 242. It cited specific incidents in which Walsh had allegedly intervened to prevent investigations from reaching conclusions that would embarrass the department. It documented meetings where he had allegedly instructed subordinates to lose complaints and discourage witnesses from pursuing formal proceedings. The evidence came from sources Michelle had not anticipated, officers who had worked under Walsh for years, who had followed his instructions without question, but who had grown uncomfortable enough with what they witnessed to cooperate with federal investigators when immunity agreements made cooperation safe. One of them had recorded conversations on a personal device, creating documentation that Walsh had never imagined possible. His arrest was conducted quietly, a courtesy extended to senior officers that would not have been offered to civilians facing similar charges. He was processed, fingerprinted, photographed, and released on bond within hours. The entire procedure took place away from cameras and reporters, insulating the department from the visual spectacle of a deputy chief in handcuffs. Michelle learned of the arrest through official channels, a notification from the DOJ that arrived in her secure email at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning. She read it in the kitchen of her Brandon home, coffee mug warming her hands against the January chill that had settled over Central Florida. Walsh indicted. The words felt both inevitable and insufficient. He was one man among many who had contributed to the problems in District 7. His removal would not transform the institution that had produced and protected him. The culture that enabled misconduct would survive his departure, adapting to new circumstances while preserving its essential character. But it was something. A deputy chief facing federal charges sent a message that rank did not guarantee immunity, that the protection hierarchy provided could be penetrated by sufficient evidence and sufficient will, that consequences were possible even for those who had spent their careers believing themselves above accountability. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thompson. "Saw the news. This is big." She typed back a response that captured her ambivalent satisfaction. "It's a start, not an ending." The distinction mattered. Walsh's indictment was not justice completed, it was justice initiated, a process that would unfold over months or years before reaching any conclusion. He would have the best attorneys money could buy. He would invoke every procedural protection available to defendants in federal court. He would fight the charges with resources and sophistication that most defendants could never match. And he might win. Federal prosecutions of law enforcement officers remained rare and difficult. Conviction rates lower than for other categories of defendants. The same institutional dynamics that protected officers from accountability within their departments often extended into courtrooms, where juries proved reluctant to believe that people in uniform had committed the crimes alleged against them. Michelle understood all of this, had understood it since she first accepted the assignment that put her in the path of Officers Mercer and Patterson on a Tuesday night in October. The fight for accountability was not a single battle, but a sustained campaign, its victories always partial and its defeats never permanent. She finished her coffee and began preparing for the day ahead. There were files to review, interviews to conduct, cases to investigate. The work continued regardless of headlines or indictments. The work was always there, demanding attention that never quite matched the scope of the problems it addressed. At the office, she found Thompson already at his desk, surrounded by documents that represented ongoing investigations unrelated to District 7. Internal Affairs handled complaints from across the department, a caseload that had not diminished simply because one case had attracted national attention. Most misconduct was mundane rather than dramatic, the ordinary failures and shortcuts that accumulated into patterns without ever generating headlines. "Rivera called," Thompson said as Michelle settled into her office. "She wants to discuss the Patterson situation." Patterson remained in limbo, suspended without pay, his career hanging on whether he successfully completed the remedial training that had been imposed as an alternative to termination. The arrangement had troubled Michelle since the findings were announced, a compromise that felt more like institutional self-protection than genuine accountability. What about Patterson? He's apparently requesting to have his suspension converted to resignation, wants to leave quietly rather than go through the training and probationary period. Resignation would allow Patterson to avoid the formal decertification process that might otherwise follow his misconduct. It would let him disappear into another career, or potentially into another law enforcement agency in a state with less rigorous background check requirements. It would deprive the accountability process of its full conclusion while allowing everyone to claim the matter had been resolved. What does Rivera think? She thinks we should consider it, says continued litigation over his suspension is consuming resources better spent on the federal case. The argument had merit from a purely practical standpoint. But Michelle's role was not purely practical. It was also symbolic, demonstrating that misconduct carried consequences regardless of how inconvenient those consequences might be for the institution. "Tell Rivera we oppose the resignation. Patterson faces the full process, same as anyone else. No special treatment because his case attracted attention." Thompson nodded and returned to his desk to relay the message. Michelle turned to her computer, opening the email application to review the morning's communications. Among them, flagged as high priority, was a message from a sender she did not immediately recognize. Subject line, "He's not the top." The message body contained no text, only an attachment. A photograph of a document, apparently taken with a phone camera, showing an email thread with sender and recipient addresses partially redacted. What remained visible suggested the email had originated from somewhere in City Hall and was addressed to someone within the police department's command structure. The content of the email discussed overtime authorization for District 7, approving additional patrol hours that coincided with dates Michelle recognized from her investigation files. Dates when traffic stops in the district had spiked. Dates when complaint rates had increased. Dates that marked escalations in the patterns she had spent 18 months documenting. Someone above Walsh had authorized the resources that enabled District 7's misconduct, someone whose identity remained hidden behind the redactions in this photograph. Michelle studied the image for several minutes, analyzing the document for any details that might reveal the sender's identity or the full chain of communication. The email headers showed timestamps but no names. The authorization form carried a signature block that was illegible in the photograph. The source of the document itself was unknown. The sender address a generic free email account that provided no identifying information. Anonymous tips were common in internal affairs work. Officers with knowledge of misconduct often feared retaliation if they reported through official channels. The photograph suggested someone with access to administrative records, someone positioned high enough in the hierarchy to see documents that ordinary officers would never encounter. Someone who wanted Michelle to know that the investigation was not complete, that Walsh was a link in a chain rather than its origin. that the accountability process had only scratched the surface of whatever corruption existed within the Tampa Police Department. She forwarded the email to Rivera with a brief note explaining its context and requesting assistance in identifying the document's source. Then she printed the photograph and added it to the physical case file that occupied one corner of her office, a growing collection of evidence that represented both progress made and questions unanswered. The investigation was not over. It was never over. Each answer led to new questions. Each conclusion revealed new complexities. The work continued, endless and essential, a permanent campaign against the institutional inertia that protected wrongdoing from consequence. 3 months later, in early April, the outcomes began to solidify into something approaching resolution. Not complete justice, which existed only in fiction, but partial accountability that represented the best the system was capable of delivering. Jason Mercer's decertification was finalized by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, permanently barring him from employment as a law enforcement officer in the state. He filed no appeal, apparently accepting that the video evidence made any challenge futile. He disappeared from Tampa shortly after the decision, relocating to a state where his background might not follow him quite so closely. Kyle Patterson completed his suspension and resigned before his probationary period began, accepting the compromise that Rivera had recommended months earlier. His decertification process was terminated as moot, leaving him free to seek law enforcement employment elsewhere if he chose. The outcome was less than Michelle had wanted, but more than the system typically provided. Linda Hoffman remained on the force, the written reprimand sitting in her personnel file like a silent accusation that affected nothing. She was transferred from District 7 to a desk assignment in professional standards, an ironic placement that put her in nominal oversight of the processes she had failed to implement. The transfer was presented as a career development opportunity rather than a consequence, institutional language obscuring the reality of what her presence represented. Robert Walsh awaited trial, his federal case moving through the pre-trial motions that would determine what evidence the jury would eventually hear. His attorneys challenged the constitutionality of the recordings that formed the core of the prosecution's case, argued that immunity agreements with cooperating witnesses tainted their testimony, and sought to suppress evidence obtained through the parallel internal affairs investigation. The legal battles would continue for months, perhaps years, before any verdict was reached. And Councilwoman Nancy Crawford, whose name appeared in the redacted email chain that Michelle had received anonymously, faced no charges, no investigation, no consequences of any kind. Whatever role she had played in enabling District 7's misconduct remained hidden behind the institutional protections that shielded elected officials from the scrutiny applied to their subordinates. Michelle sat in her office on a Thursday afternoon in April, reviewing the case file that had consumed nearly 2 years of her professional life. The documentation filled 3 bankers' boxes, thousands of pages representing hundreds of incidents that together painted a picture of systemic failure and individual misconduct. The pattern or practice investigation continued, its timeline measured in years rather than months. A consent decree seemed likely, a court-supervised reform agreement that would impose federal oversight on the Tampa Police Department for some specified period. The decree would require changes to policies, training, supervision, and accountability mechanisms. It would establish benchmarks and reporting requirements. It would create consequences for failure to comply. But consent decrees were imperfect instruments, their effectiveness dependent on the will of the parties to implement them meaningfully. Other cities had operated under similar agreements for decades without achieving the transformations they promised. The decree would be a beginning, not an ending, another tool in the endless work of holding institutions accountable for their conduct. Her phone rang with a call from a number she recognized as belonging to the DOJ Civil Rights Division attorney leading the investigation. She answered with the professional greeting that had become automatic over months of regular communication. "Director Sanders, Agent Williams from the FBI would like to schedule a meeting regarding the dashcam footage." The dashcam footage, a detail that had troubled Michelle since the early stages of the investigation. Mercer's patrol vehicle was equipped with a dashboard camera that should have recorded the 2-mile follow before the traffic stop was initiated. That footage had never been located. The official explanation cited a technical malfunction, a data corruption error that had rendered the recording unrecoverable. Michelle had never believed the explanation. Technical malfunctions that conveniently destroyed evidence of misconduct were too common to be coincidental. Someone had ensured that the dashcam footage disappeared, erasing documentation that might have revealed whatever had prompted Mercer to follow her vehicle in the first place. What specifically does Agent Williams want to discuss? IT forensics recovered 8 minutes of footage from a backup system we didn't know existed. The quality is poor, but there's something on it he thinks you need to see. 8 minutes of footage. The 2-mile follow had taken approximately 8 minutes, the time between when she first noticed the patrol car in her mirror and when the blue lights finally activated. Whatever that footage showed, it had been important enough for someone to try erasing it. Schedule the meeting. I'll clear my calendar. She hung up and stared at the case file boxes stacked against her office wall. The investigation that had seemed to be concluding was apparently not concluded at all. New evidence was emerging. New questions were forming. The work continued, as it always continued, its end always receding beyond the next discovery. Thompson appeared in her doorway with papers that required her signature, routine administrative tasks that persisted regardless of extraordinary circumstances. She signed without reading closely, trusting his judgment on matters that did not require her direct attention. The FBI recovered dashcam footage. His expression shifted to surprise, and then to the focused intensity that characterized his approach to investigative work. What's on it? I don't know yet, but apparently it was important enough for someone to try destroying it. That suggests premeditation. It suggests a lot of things. We'll know more after the meeting. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, giving Michelle time to prepare for whatever revelations the recovered footage might contain. She spent the intervening days reviewing the timeline of October 15th, looking for gaps in the narrative that 8 minutes of dashcam footage might fill. The question that had troubled her since the night of her arrest returned with renewed urgency. Why had Mercer followed her? The invalid Bolo provided a convenient excuse, but the dispatch record showed he had not queried her license plate until after initiating the stop. Something else had prompted his attention, some reason unrelated to the stated justification that had caused him to single out her vehicle among the hundreds of cars traveling Dale Mabry Highway that evening. The parking garage surveillance mentioned in his body cam statements suggested prior awareness of her presence at the convention center. But how had he known she was there? And why had that knowledge prompted a response that escalated into unlawful detention and arrest? The answers, she suspected, would emerge from the recovered footage or from its absence. Evidence that survived destruction attempts often revealed more than the content alone, its existence proving that someone had recognized its significance and acted to suppress it. The FBI meeting took place in a secure conference room at the Federal Building in downtown Tampa, a facility designed for discussions that required protection from electronic surveillance or unauthorized observation. Agent Williams was a 15-year veteran of the Bureau's Civil Rights Division, a white man in his late 40s whose career had focused on police misconduct cases across the southeastern United States. He played the recovered footage without preamble, letting the images speak for themselves. The quality was degraded, the product of a backup system that had captured data at lower resolution than the primary recording. But the content was clear enough to understand. Mercer's patrol vehicle following a silver Nissan Altima along Dale Mabry Highway. Radio communication visible through the timestamp overlay, though the audio had not survived the recovery process. Then, at the 3-minute mark, something that made Michelle's breath catch in her throat. A second vehicle pulling alongside Mercer's cruiser. Not another patrol car, but an unmarked sedan whose driver was visible for approximately 4 seconds as it passed under a streetlight. Deputy Chief Robert Walsh. The footage showed Walsh's vehicle pulling ahead of Mercer, then slowing until Mercer caught up. A brief exchange visible through the windows, though the content was impossible to determine without audio. Then Walsh's vehicle accelerating away, leaving Mercer to continue the pursuit that would eventually culminate in Michelle's unlawful arrest. The implication was unmistakable. Walsh had been present during the follow, had communicated with Mercer before the stop was initiated, had possibly directed the entire encounter from a vehicle that would leave no official record of its involvement: the parking garage surveillance, the convention center. Mercer's unexplained awareness of her location. The pieces assembled into a picture that suggested not random misconduct, but deliberate targeting. Someone had known she would be at that conference. Someone had arranged for her vehicle to be followed. Someone had orchestrated what followed with enough sophistication to nearly succeed in avoiding documentation. "We believe Walsh directed the stop," Agent Williams said, confirming the conclusion Michelle had already reached. "The footage establishes his presence and suggests coordination with Officer Mercer. Combined with the other evidence, this supports additional charges of conspiracy and obstruction." "How did he know I would be there?" "We're still investigating that. But someone accessed your department calendar 3 days before the conference. The access came from a terminal in City Hall." City Hall, the location that connected to the redacted email chain she had received anonymously, the administrative center where Councilwoman Crawford maintained her office and conducted the political operations that supported her position on the Public Safety Committee. The investigation was expanding again, its scope growing to encompass not just police misconduct, but potential coordination between law enforcement and political structures designed to maintain institutional protection for wrongdoing. The pattern or practice case was becoming something larger, an investigation into systemic corruption that crossed departmental and governmental boundaries. Michelle absorbed the information with the professional detachment that effective investigation required. But beneath that detachment, something else stirred. Anger at the scope of what she was uncovering, determination to follow the evidence wherever it led, and a grim satisfaction in knowing that whoever had targeted her had fundamentally miscalculated the consequences. They had arrested the wrong woman. They had created evidence of their own conspiracy. They had handed her the tools to dismantle whatever protection they believed their positions provided. The investigation continued. New threads emerged. Old assumptions dissolved under the weight of new evidence. The work stretched forward into an indefinite future, its completion always somewhere beyond the horizon. Subscribe now if you want to see how deep this conspiracy goes. The investigation is just beginning. Months passed. The federal case against Walsh expanded to include the new charges suggested by the recovered footage. Councilwoman Crawford faced questions from reporters about her relationship with the police department, questions she deflected with political skill that suggested long practice in avoiding accountability. The consent decree negotiations produced a draft agreement that would impose 5 years of federal oversight on the Tampa Police Department, with provisions for extension if benchmarks were not met. Michelle continued her work, investigating new cases while monitoring the progress of the one that had changed everything. Her daughter graduated from Florida State with a degree in criminal justice, choosing a path that would eventually bring her into the same system her mother had spent decades trying to reform. The irony was not lost on either of them, discussed in conversations that acknowledged both the problems and the possibilities that work within flawed institutions presented. In late summer, nearly a year after the traffic stop, a federal jury convicted Robert Walsh on 4 counts of civil rights violations and 2 counts of obstruction of justice. The verdict carried a potential sentence of up to 40 years in federal prison, though actual sentencing would likely produce something less. What mattered was the conviction itself, the formal acknowledgement that a deputy chief of police had violated the constitutional rights of citizens he had sworn to protect. Michelle learned of the verdict through a text from Rivera, 3 words that carried the weight of years of work. Guilty. All counts. She read the message in her office, surrounded by files representing cases that continued regardless of any individual outcome. The conviction was significant, a rare instance of accountability reaching the upper levels of a police hierarchy. But it was also incomplete. One person held responsible for patterns that involved many. Crawford remained untouched, her political position apparently insulated from whatever role she had played in enabling misconduct. The anonymous source who had provided the redacted email chain had not resurfaced, leaving questions about the full scope of political involvement unanswered. The 8 minutes of recovered dashcam footage had proven Walsh's presence, but not the identity of whoever had accessed Michelle's calendar and triggered the chain of events that followed. The investigation remained open. New evidence might emerge. New sources might come forward. The work continued, its conclusions always provisional, its victories always partial. On the anniversary of her arrest, Michelle drove past the spot on Dale Mabry Highway where blue lights had first appeared in her mirror. The location looked unremarkable in daylight, just another stretch of commercial development that characterized suburban Tampa. Nothing about it suggested the significance of what had happened there, the encounter that had exposed corruption, reaching from patrol officers to deputy chiefs to the political structures that protected them. She did not stop, did not mark the moment with any ceremony or reflection beyond the brief acknowledgement that anniversaries sometimes prompted. The past was documented, preserved in files that would outlast the individuals involved. What mattered now was the work that continued, the cases that demanded attention, the system that required constant pressure to move toward accountability. Her phone rang with a call from Thompson, reporting on developments in an unrelated investigation. She answered, transitioning from memory to present responsibility with the ease of someone who had made such transitions countless times. The work continued. It always continued. Not toward any final resolution, but toward the incremental improvements that were the most anyone could realistically achieve. Justice was not a destination, but a direction, a constant striving toward standards that receded even as you approached them. Michelle understood this, had understood it since she first pinned on a badge and discovered the gap between what policing was supposed to be and what it actually was. The understanding did not produce despair. It produced determination, the recognition that the work mattered precisely because it would never be complete. She drove through Tampa streets that had witnessed her arrest and her vindication, her violation and her triumph. The city continued around her, indifferent to the individual dramas that played out within its boundaries. Millions of people living their lives, most of them never encountering the systems of power and accountability that Michelle spent her career navigating. But for those who did encounter those systems, for those who found themselves targeted by officers like Mercer or protected by officials like Walsh, her work mattered. The documentation mattered. The investigations mattered. The slow, grinding process of accountability mattered, even when its outcomes fell short of what justice truly required. She turned toward the office, toward the files and meetings and decisions that awaited her. The investigation was not over. The work was not complete. The fight for accountability continued, one case at a time, one violation at a time, one small victory at a time, until the next encounter, until the next opportunity, until the next moment when someone with power assumed they were dealing with someone without it, and learned too late how wrong their assumption had been. The end was not the end. It was only a pause, a moment of relative resolution before the next challenge emerged. The system would generate new misconduct. Officers would make new choices. Citizens would have their rights violated in ways that demanded response. And Michelle Sanders would be there, documenting everything, building cases, pursuing accountability with the patient persistence that the work required. Not because she believed she could fix everything, but because she believed that trying mattered, that each small improvement created space for the next, that the arc of justice bent toward accountability only when people dedicated their lives to bending it. The work continued. It always would. It will on.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.